We've lost touch with today is the importance of oral testimony in the ancient world. In a world where Plutarch's Life of Alexander is highly acclaimed but written almost 400 years later, we forget that when we don't have stenographers and we don't have tape recorders and we don't have television, we have a practiced sense of oral tradition in the ancient world, especially among the Jews. Now, when you look at this with the resurrection of Jesus, here's what you come up with. If we put the cross at approximately 30 AD, Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 1 that his conversion was soon afterwards. Critics say 1 to 3 years. Let's just take an average of 2. Put Paul's conversion about 2 years after the cross. Paul says 3 years later he went up to Jerusalem to talk to Peter and to James, the brother of Jesus, and they discussed the gospel. That's just 5 years later. And Paul says that they talked about the center of the faith. Now, 14 years later, Galatians chapter 2, they again talk about the gospel, and again, these other pillars of the church, Paul calls them, said that what he was preaching was the gospel facts. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 11, Paul says they were preaching the same thing he was. We get both of them saying that this preaching goes back to the early church. But again, Paul dates this material from just 5 years after the cross. That's how early this report comes. And we get this, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and following. Paul says, I delivered unto you that which I also received as of first importance, how that Jesus died for our sins. He was buried, and he rose again the third day, according to the scriptures. And actually calls him Christ there. We have a witness there to who he thought he was. We get the claims of Jesus. We get his death. We get his resurrection. And Paul said, I got this from people very early. Critics think it happened about 5 or 6 years after the cross. So you've got eyewitness testimony from a very early time frame. Let me tell you something. In the ancient world, we do not see time gaps like this with careful eyewitness testimony thrown in with virtually no gap here. This is why critics find the testimony for the resurrection so difficult to explain away.